the 6th of July 2023, over $125 million was siphoned away from Multichain, one of the biggest bridges in crypto and the primary bridge for Fantom. In this video, we're going to confront Michael Kong, the CEO of Fantom, to find out what happened. Was this a hack? Was this a rug pull? What impact did this have on the Fantom ecosystem? And what the path moving forward is from here. Hope you guys enjoy this interview. Let's get straight into it.
Hey, Michael. Hope you're doing well. Thank you for making the time to jump on and address the community. I know it's been a busy time for you and the team at the Fantom ecosystem. Take us back to a few weeks ago, July the 6th. How did you hear about what happened with Multichain? What were your initial reactions? How did the team feel? How did you respond to it? What happened? Take us back to that moment.
Yeah, so what happened was, it was in the afternoon around like 3 or 4 p.m. Eastern time when people were commenting, hey, there seems to be some like weird movements of funds from the multi-chain bridge. And, we started like looking into it like right away. And we're like, okay, there's a multi-chain team like moving the funds to a new bridge or something like that. What is going on? And then, we had to look more about the transfers and ask the multi-chain team. And, they said that these were like abnormal movement of transactions. And as soon as they mentioned that, we knew that something like really, really like not right was happening. And so, I think it was within, if I'm not mistaken, within like an hour period of time that the initial transfers from the multi-chain bridge were made to the 6 external wallet addresses. But then we're a little confused because, usually if it's just like a typical hack that goes on, what happens is that you have the funds very quickly get obfuscated by the attacker, right? Because they want to make it very hard to trace those funds so they can be able to spend it. Because ultimately, if you just take out funds but you're not able to move it around because it's blacklisted or being traced, then it's not very useful as an attacker, right? And so what we were kind of confused about is the fact that the funds were just moved from the multi-chain bridge to the externally owned wallets, and they're just kind of just sitting there, even very much so to this day, right? They weren't like collateralized, they weren't laundered or obfuscated by the looks of it, and so we were quite confused about what was going on. And the on-chain transaction data, which I can get into more information about, combined with other information that we've discovered a little bit later, makes us really think that what has occurred with multi-chain is not like a typical hack or a typical attack, that it may be more related to law enforcement, and law enforcement that may not necessarily be above board from everything that we've been hearing. And that is in itself like very, very concerning. But yeah, that's how we kind of like found out. And what's also a bit odd about those transactions is that, the multi-chain team is based in China, and that's a 12-hour time zone difference from Eastern time, right? And so that meant that these transactions would have happened around 3 to 4 a.m. In China time. And I don't really know why they were made at that specific time, as opposed to like any other time earlier, or like at a more quote unquote like reasonable daytime, like China time. But they were definitely made like 3 to 4 a.m. China time. I mean, we know that as a fact when you just look at the history of the transactions.
Got it. So just taking a step back here, what was the total dollar impact of the multi-chain situations? We've heard different numbers kind of being flying around. From your estimation, what is the total impact, and what percentage of that can be attributed to the Fantom ecosystem and Fantom projects?
Yeah, so based on like our preliminary analysis, it's a little bit difficult to calculate because of the way that the router system works, is my understanding, right? But I think more than $200 million in total that has been moved from the multi-chain bridge to these external wallets. Not just the 6 addresses, but a couple of other addresses as well, which I can get into, because I think the multi-chain team was trying to save the rest of the funds, but then they weren't able to do that in the end. But I think the total exposure to the Fantom ecosystem is probably around $70 million of it. So it is the case that a majority of the funds that were sitting on the multi-chain bridge that were moved off in early July were not actually on specifically related to the Fantom chain. There were a combination of all like other chains. And remember, multi-chain wasn't just a bridge for Fantom; it was a bridge that connected to many other chains. So I'm pretty sure all of the popular EVM based chains or Ethereum virtual machine based chains, including Ethereum, were connected to multi-chain, and they held assets on those chains, right? As well as like many other like smaller chains. So there have been a lot of other chains that have been significantly impacted. A few of those other chains and projects who have lost funds outside of the Fantom ecosystem have also like reached out to us. And what they're looking to do is figure out, okay, first of all, like what is going on? Like, is there any information you can share? And is there any way that we can help out, for example, raising awareness about this, petitioning, the Chinese police or the Chinese government who might not really know what is going on and the amount of funds that have been taken and who and where these funds actually belong to, or who do they actually belong to. So we are coordinating with a variety of different projects to try and give the best response that we can.
Got it. So of that 70 million, would you say Fantom was the most affected ecosystem out there?
As a proportion of the total TVL, the Fantom chain was like the most impacted, that's for sure. But in terms of like the overall aggregate of the funds that were moved from the multi-chain bridge, as I mentioned before, I believe the majority of it by far was taken from other chains across a variety of different chains and different projects. I mean, I've had projects reach out for me from other chains that have unfortunately had millions of dollars lost. In one case, I think even tens of millions of dollars, apparently. So, it's a very, very serious issue. Obviously, it's a big impact for the Fantom network, and it really, really does suck. It is also a big impact for, I think, the blockchain ecosystem as a whole, and many chains and other projects that were also affected. And so we're all kind of like aligned in trying to resolve this as much as possible. And what do I mean by resolving this? What I mean by resolving this is, if the funds are really in the custody of some sort of local law enforcement, that they're notified about it, and that we can start figuring out how do we get these funds back, because that is what the interest is for all of the parties involved. And of course, this money does not belong to the local Chinese police or multi-chain. These funds belong to the users of multi-chain, right? Including the many Fantom users that use multi-chain, as well as other users from other chains. So that really is the ultimate objective. Unfortunately, I can't give really a timeline on it. I would hope for it to be resolved as quickly as possible. It may take some time, but as I mentioned before, we're also working with a law firm to try and figure out, get official confirmation that the multi-chain team really is detained in Kongmin, as they've said, and as multiple sources to me have indicated really is the case. And then what you have to do, we've been advised, is perhaps put in some sort of claim process or tell the right authorities, hey, this is where the money comes from, give them proof of it. And so it makes it harder for them to say, oh, it's the proceeds of crime or Ponzi or something like that, where if you don't tell them that where the funds really come from, they might just by default say that it's the proceeds of crime, as I just mentioned.
So thank you for that. So of the 200 million that was siphoned away, we did hear that Circle froze some funds and some wallet addresses. Do we know what quantity is that? What percentage of the 200 million roughly is frozen?
Yeah, so to give credit to Circle and Teve, they did put in freezing actions pretty fast, within 1 to 2 days, and the amount of stablecoin funds that are frozen. And just to be clear, this is only to do with the issuance on Ethereum, which is what they're able to do in terms of blacklisting, and that amounted to approximately 60 or a bit over 65 million stablecoins, if I'm not mistaken. So I think about 62 million of that is related to USDC or US dollar Circle, and about 3 million or a bit under 2 to 3 million is to do with US dollar Teva. So those assets are frozen, and so they can't be moved at all. So one thing that we are thinking about as an alternative is, would it be possible to get those funds reissued to the right users who they belong to, right? Now, I can't give an answer as to like, how feasible that is, like how long that would take, what exactly the process would be. But obviously, like Circle and Tether still have those funds in the reserve, so they still have the backing for it, right?
Yep.
But like the good news is that like a good portion of the funds, particularly related to stablecoin funds, have indeed been frozen, which would, if there is some sort of like negative operation going on, sorry, not negative operation, but if there's some sort of like potential like seizing of funds going on, if that is the incentive of some individuals in China, that this is less of an incentive for them to go ahead and try and do that, because the funds are frozen and everybody's looking at the wallets and monitoring what is going on.
So you mentioned 65 has been frozen. So of the remaining 135 million, what leads us to believe that it's probably under the control of some other government authorities? What's given us that indication? Or is it just the way the story's played out?
Yeah, it's a consistency between what Multichain has recently put out, me talking to multiple individuals in the Multichain team, and various different sources that I've been talking to in China as well, right? And so kind of like when you think about it logically, right, there's kind of like two possibilities here, really. One possibility is that, the Multichain team really has been detained and the assets have been, confiscated, and they've been held under custody under some sort of police force or by some sort of government, and I do think it's the local government, or the Multichain team have basically done a ruse, right? Like that it's all just like a trick, it's all just like a deception, and that they're really did just like rug the funds or steal the funds for themselves, right? So those are really the two possibilities.
So at this point, there's no definitive evidence that Zhao Jun has been detained. Nobody's got any definitive evidence behind that.
So I don't have, to be clear, I don't have concrete evidence, but I do have a lot of circumstantial evidence from multiple different sources that really is the case, which makes me think that really did happen, right? And so let me kind of like explain like how I came to my reasoning. So if you're like, if you work on the assumption that it's kind of like, or if you're looking at it from the perspective of, is it a rug pull, right? Well, a lot of the facts that we know about is very much inconsistent with that being a rug pull, right? So the strongest evidence of that not being a rug pull is the on-chain transactions, right? Which we know definitively, what has occurred there, right? Because we can all see it on chain, right? And as I mentioned before, like a typical hacker would try and obfuscate the funds as quickly as possible, right? Because they don't want to be frozen, like what happened with the stable coins. They want to make it, they want to lose, trace of the funds, etc. They want to collateralize it so they can spend the funds as quickly as possible, right? And basically like launder it, so it's hard to track. But in this case, when it comes to the funds, they've literally just moved from the multi-chain bridge to the externally owned wallets, and they're just sitting there, right? So if a hacker really was trying to like, lose trace of the funds, they would have very, very quickly, tried to make a whole bunch of transactions, right? But to this day, to my knowledge, they're just sitting there, right? And so that is inconsistent with the behavior of a rug pull or typical hack, right? The other thing is that, I'm very sure that a multi-chain team is like, still in China, right? And so, and China has very strict rules against like fraud and theft, right? Very, very strict. It wouldn't make any sense that, they would be staying in China doing this sort of activity, getting all this attention on them, and thinking that they could somehow like get away with it and disappear with all the money, right? Because there's a lot of attention on this because of the situation and the amount of money that's been taken, right? So it's very, very public as well, right? And the third point is that I haven't heard of any evidence whatsoever that would indicate that it's like it's been a rug pull, right? Like none of my sources have suggested to me that that really is the case or that they think it's the case. What all the sources have been telling me is that they really do think that they have been taken in by what's likely to be the local Kongmin police, right? And that the local Kongmin police, is conducting some sort of investigation, and that they may actually be interested really in trying to take the funds for themselves because a lot of provincial governments apparently in China, have lost a lot of money because of the COVID lockdowns, and they're trying to look for money. And if that's true, that's very, very concerning. And so what we want to do is really like confirm that he actually is being detained in Kunming and going from there. Because if that's the case, and we know definitively where the funds, who is holding the funds for sure. And so again, like, we're still waiting for confirmation anytime now. And as soon as I get confirmation, I'll try and share what I am able to share. So, in terms of like the different theories, like the theory that they've been, detained, I think is far, far more likely than the alternative theory being like some sort of rug pull or some sort of like trick.
Okay, thank you for that. So I guess, as you can appreciate, when I mentioned to the community that I was going to be sitting down with you to kind of get caught up on the whole multi-chain saga, the biggest question that everybody said is, what is the plan to make users whole again, right? Even though that we know it was an attack on the bridge and not the Fantom ecosystem, there seems to be a responsibility and a kind of demand from you guys that users are kind of made to be whole again. And so you mentioned there that there's a bunch of funds frozen. You've mentioned that you're going down this route with lawyers to try to put pressure on the Chinese authorities if they are indeed holding the funds. What other plans do we have to make users whole again, if any? What are the other irons in the fire that you're working on right now?
Yeah, so there's a few ideas that we've kind of like explored internally. At this point in time, I don't want to like, say something definitive. Otherwise, people would say like, oh, you mentioned you made this promise or that promise, even though they're not necessarily promises. But we have some ideas about like how we can try and help, users be made whole, or at least partially be made whole, in the current time, or maybe like sometime in the future. That being said, like,
so is it fair to say it's a priority for you and the Fantom Foundation to make those affected whole again?
Yeah, that is like ultimately like our objective, right? And the reason why we haven't like talked a lot more about like other ideas that we have is because the primary focus that we want to do is get the funds that have been taken by that appear to have been taken in China, right? And the reason being is that even if users were like made whole quite quickly, or they're made whole in the future, the fact remains is that these funds are still missing, right? And that to me is like fundamentally wrong, right? Whether it was a rug pull, which I don't believe, as I illustrated before, or if it's been like wrongfully confiscated and been held by local police force or someone in China, that's wrong, and we shouldn't let people get away with stealing funds, right? And so really the main focus is finding different avenues of trying to get the funds returned, right?
Well, the interesting thing here, Michael, is with what you're saying here is, if it could indeed be the Chinese government, then there's a natural route there to say, hang on, this is foreign money, we need this money back. And if you're saying they decide to not return those funds, we now have a diplomatic issue on our hands, don't we? So this becomes far bigger than initially thought.
Yeah, so from different people I've been talking to, it seems like the consistent theme is that it might not be the Chinese federal government that is necessarily even aware about what is going on, right? Because I have heard stories about other similar incidences occurring, not necessarily related to crypto, where local officials have been found to have or been determined to have wrongfully detained people and confiscated assets according to the federal government in China, right? And once the Chinese government was really aware about what was going on, they kind of stepped in and said, hey guys, you can't do this. This is a bad look for us. This is foreign money. It's not Chinese money. You kind of like need to drop the case and let it go, right? Now, I'm not saying that is guaranteed or necessarily what is happening in this specific case to do with multi-chain, but it is like a consistent theme that I heard from multiple different sources, right? So you're absolutely absolutely right. Like, one of the things that we're talking about is thinking about, or one of the things that we've been discussing with different parties is, and amongst ourselves is, what is the best way to notify the Chinese federal government, at least for them to be aware about what is going on, right? And what we think is probably most effective is if we get a lot of chains, a lot of affected projects, to write a declaration together, send it to, the Chinese government, whether it's like in an embassy or through other means, and tell them, hey, this incident has happened. These are the facts. This is the reporting on it. To illustrate to them that it's quite serious, and that people in outside of China are very aware about what's going on and are reporting on it, and that these funds do not belong to Chinese users, or at least the vast majority of them do not belong to anybody in China, and that they actually belong to foreign money across many different jurisdictions, and that we need to have this money returned because it's not illicit money, it's not Ponzi money or anything like that. It is money that belongs to the users of Fantom and other chains and projects, and therefore we need to get it returned. So the good news is that I've been in contact with various projects on Fantom and off Fantom, and we're all aligned in that we all want to get the money back, right? Like that's what we're really, really interested in here, because that's what really needs to be done.
Absolutely. And so if it is that this Chinese route hits a dead end, to reiterate, would you say it's a theoretical option that Fantom could indeed delve into their war chest to kind of fill the gap?
Potentially, yeah. And how that plays out, in terms of any possible distribution of funds is actually a little bit complicated though, because I know that people in the community, I think, have been kind of debating. It's like, okay, even if there was a return of funds, from China or from whoever, right? How would those funds actually be distributed? And the reason I mention that is because obviously, when the multi-chain incident happened, people were holding a bunch of multi-chain assets, and then some of those people traded it out at different price points. And so the question is who do you actually return the funds to? Do you return the funds to when it's a snapshot? Well, if you do that, it's kind of unfair for the people who bought USD, these multi-chain assets afterwards, right? Yep. Or who sold at different price points, right? Because some people might be getting more money than other people, right? But conversely, if you're just doing a one-to-one redemption, right? The problem there is that, well, the people who currently own the multi-chain assets, they might not have been the ones who were actually affected at the time of the initial transfers, right? Like the 7th of July.
Yep.
And so it's a bit complicated because you want any sort of distribution to be fair to different users, right? And so that's something that we're still trying to figure out, which is why we haven't really said anything definitively about okay, this is exactly how a redemption will work, or this is exactly how user funds will be returned, because it's not so much an easy answer considering what people have done, after the whole multi-chain situation kind of unraveled on the 7th of July, if that kind of makes sense.
So have you given yourself a time frame to pursue the Chinese route of recovering the money? What kind of time frame are you working towards, where it's like, I'm going to give this X number of months, and if we're not making any progress with the Chinese authorities, we're going to go to plan B, which is take some funds from the war chest or whatever and start making people whole again. Plus, we're going to work on the circle assets as well to see if we can get those reissued. What kind of time frame are we talking here for users affected?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. Right now, I can't really say a time frame just because it's a little bit early to figure it out, and that's because we're trying to receive more legal advice to really think about an exact timeline and an exact strategy as well. So kind of the ideas that we have are, as I mentioned before, working with the lawyers to confirm that multi-chain team has really been held in Kunmin, why they've been held in Kunmin, and to notify them that this money really belongs to who it actually belongs to, which is the users I talked about, right? And then the other strategy is, the more publicity, notification of the Chinese federal government about what is actually going on, or appears to be going on in one of their local cities. And the reason I can't give a time frame on that is because I simply don't really know at this point in time, right? And that is one of the things that I'm trying to figure out, how long it will take. And once I have an indication about how long it would take, I will try and share to the community as much as I can.
Got it. So you mentioned that some of the other project representatives were reaching out to you to see if you could help. For those who aren't really familiar with the kind of history of multi-chain, why would it be that other projects are reaching out to Fantom specifically to help them with the situation, even if perhaps they're bigger chains themselves?
Well, I think they might also be reaching out to each other as well. So I don't want to make it sound like, Fantom is the party with all the information and all the parties are just contacting Fantom one-to-one, right?
But I guess what I'm getting at here is, why do they think Fantom could have more information? Could it be to do with Andre and his history with multi-chain?
Yeah. So like, just to take a step back about like the history of multi-chain, right? So multi-chain was a very well-known bridge, right? And Andre did like work on some of the multi-chain technology early, I think in 2018, 2019. To be clear, like he hasn't worked on multi-chain since then, to my knowledge. But he was part of like the original like or he like worked on like some of the original technology, right? And so he did have like a pretty good like relations with the multi-chain team, and multi-chain team and the multi-chain bridge, was like the first bridge to my knowledge that integrated with Fantom, right? And then because it had the first mover advantage and had a good reputation, it got like a lot of traction, right? And it wasn't just like the Fantom team that thought that multi-chain was a great project, right? There was also like many other like chains that are out there, right? Which is why they were able to have TVL of billions of dollars during during like 2021. Is why that in December 2021 they were able to raise over they were able to raise about $60 million at a valuation of $1.2 billion, and they raised from a variety of very well-known funds, right? So for example, Primitive Ventures, Binance Labs, Circle Ventures, Hashkey, Sequoia, etc. So multi-chain was a very well-known project, and it was trusted by a lot of chains, which is why a lot of the TVL, there's a lot of TVL from Fantom there, but also from a lot of the other chains as well, right? Yeah. And so I think the reason why like projects have reached out to us and maybe they're reaching out to others as well is because we're all affected, right? And they know that Fantom is the most affected in terms of a proportion of our TVL, and I think they're also aware of like, the fact that we've had, probably, I'm guessing here, but probably the most communication of all the affected parties with the actual multi-chain team itself, right? So the multi-chain team itself, we've been in contact with a few of them. It's been a bit difficult because some of them have not really been willing to talk because they say that they're worried about the situation in China, especially being in China themselves. But of the people that we've been able to talk to, we've been able to try and get some sort of insights as to like what is going on and trying to corroborate that with like other sources, right? And so I think it's for those reasons that people have reached out to us, because they want more information and they want to figure out together, okay, like who can we petition? Like how can we petition? Like let's put together like a document that we can send off, with facts and links and that sort of thing. So I think that's what is like kind of going on.
How soon after the situation were you able to get in contact with somebody at Multichain? So on the 6th of July, it all went down. How quickly were you able to reach out to somebody, and who were you liaising with at Multichain at that point? How high up the chain were you able to get?
I can't, I don't want to disclose names if that's okay. But we talked to a couple of individuals at Multichain and we asked them pretty quickly, like, what is going on? And they, I can't remember like how quickly they replied, but they did reply around that time and said, yeah, we don't recognize these transactions. They're abnormal. We're trying to figure out what is going on, right? So, we had communication on and off with the multi-chain team. It's kind of hard because what they said is that they don't have first-hand knowledge of exactly what is going on, right? They said that they were passing on information to us that they heard secondhand from other individuals that had perhaps first-hand knowledge or claimed to have first-hand knowledge of what was going on with Zhao Zhen and other people in the multi-chain team, right? So I just want to be clear, like everything that I was hearing wasn't necessarily from a primary source. It was from like a secondary source from the multi-chain team. So even then, like what the multi-chain team might have been saying to us might not have been like exactly correct, right? And what the multi-chain team members were being told themselves may not have been exactly correct, right? Which made the situation a lot more complicated and confusing and that sort of thing. So what we try to do in that circumstance is basically cooperate, right? Like cooperate with different sources that we hear, thinking about it logically, putting all the pieces together. And that's why I think there's a very high likelihood that the multi-chain team really has been detained, and they have been detained in the city of Kongmin. But as I've stressed out before, we're still trying to very much like officially confirm that as quickly as possible.
Got it. So once you reached out to them, how long before you were able to get access to any, or did you get access to any internal data or any comms, any evidence, or was it all just verbal communication with the team at Multichain?
So I don't. I'm not exactly sure what you mean. Like we've communicated mostly with the Multichain team on on written text, right? But in terms of like like how reliable the information is, well, as I mentioned before, they too were getting sources from a second hand. Let's just put it that way, right? And so the situation was very much confusing. I think they were kind of confused about what was going on about the whole apparent detainment situation. But having like knowing what we know now and putting it together, we do have a much better understanding of what has really or what we believe has really occurred on the with regards to multi-chain, if that makes sense.
Okay, so let's take a step back then. So if you recall, just over a month or so ago now, I believe, the multi-chain had its first wobble, right? They had their wobble. There was the initial kind of panic around it. I lost you there. Oh, and at the time, a lot of the community were quite worried, right? There was a little bit of panic, and Fantom Foundation came out and said, it's all running operationally, we're good to go, and kind of gave it the strength. Can you just fill us in on what happened in the first instance and how that connected to what happened on July the 6th?
So we heard around the same time, to my knowledge, that like they weren't able to contact Zhaojun, and the Multichain team weren't really able to to share much information about it, because I think they probably also were a bit confused about what was going on. But they did tell us that they were going to continue running the services operationally. Yeah, there were a few like routers to do with other chains that were not like exactly working. They were working to fix that, and I think that might have been an issue before even like they were not able to contact Zhaojun. So the situations may not be connected, if that makes sense. And then it appeared that the Fantom chain was working fine, because that's what they informed us about. And we went in and did some transactions, and it looked like everything was fine. So we reported as such that we believe that the Fantom chain was operating as normal, and that like the operations would continue even with the absence of Zhaojun. Now, obviously, what we know now is that was not the case, right? And so I do regret having made that mistake in the past. And I think what's important to know is that, like, to my knowledge, like other chains and projects also, I think weren't they had also not told people to get the funds off Multichain as quickly as possible. A lot of people on Fantom and also other chains continue to use the Multichain service, which is why there is which is why the service continued to run throughout the entirety of June. It looked like everything was fine. It looked like Zhaojun's disappearance was not ideal, but it wasn't going to impact the services overall, which is why that what happened on the 6th or 7th of July was quite shocking, because that was very much unexpected. And then it turned out later, and we didn't know this at the time until very recently, that apparently Zhaojun always had access to the MPC nodes, or the ability to confirm transactions and move funds unilaterally. As the Multichain team put out in one of the tweets, they said that from the very beginning Zhaojun had access, right? And that was shocking, because our understanding about how Multichain works is that it was the MPC nodes, or the multi-party computation nodes, that were validating transactions. And our understanding is that was that most of those were not located in China, but across different jurisdictions, right? And so had we known that Zhaojun just had full access the entire time, and other chains and projects knew that, I think we wouldn't we would have definitely raised this as a concern well before.
So are you saying Fantom would lie to them? So when you started your relationship with Multichain and they became the primary bridge for the Fantom ecosystem, were you told that he doesn't have unilateral access? Is that the case when you did your due diligence?
So I don't want to use the word that you use, but it definitely, to my knowledge, well, to my knowledge, it wasn't communicated to us, right? And I don't think it was communicated to other chains, to other parties. And it might have been the case that some of the multi-chain employees as well were not aware of that actual situation, at least from what I heard from some of them. That's what they've claimed to me, right? Is that they didn't find out as well until very recently. So
it's quite a damning revelation, really, because if we're talking one of the biggest bridges in the crypto space, used by many big chains, as we know, and for the founder to have unilateral access, and all these chains would have done their due diligence, they would have asked the question. So it leads us to believe, what's going on there and kind of what information was shared with the chain operators at the time.
Yeah, it's quite hard to figure out this information, right? Because the multi-party computation technology, it is a very real technology, right? And it's used by a variety of different companies out there, right? It's not just used by multi-chain. It's not just like multi-chain technology. So, there are other well-known custodian providers, companies that use MPC technology, right? So, from our perspective, and I think from the perspective of many like other chains and projects out there, the technology like is legitimate, right? The MPC technology more specifically, right?
So when Andre was at the project, was there any evidence that Zhaojun controlled all the keys then as well?
I don't know what other people knew or didn't know. All I can say is that, to my knowledge, I didn't know that information. I don't think like Fantom Foundation knew that information as well. I don't know like how much of the community knew that information as well, right? But just to be clear, there were also several audits done on the technology to do with like the smart contracts that interact with the MPC protocol. And to my knowledge, they came out like pretty well, right? And in the past, like multi-chain, when they had a number of incidences, the one that I can really think of is back in January 2022, right? When there was vulnerabilities with the smart contracts. The multi-chain team, to my knowledge, did work like pretty well and pretty fast in trying to resolve that with a couple of white hat people that I know, right? To try and save as many funds as possible. And I think they might have lost maybe $1 to $3 million or something like that. But they did work like very quickly to try and resolve the situation as much as possible, to my knowledge. So, in terms of the like communication in the past and the ability to fix issues, it seemed to have been pretty good, right?
Yep.
And they did have a lot of trust across different ecosystems, right? And you can see it by the fact of how much investment they got. Like, as I mentioned before, in December 2021, they raised over $60 million from well-known parties. The fact that they were integrated with so many different chains, and the fact that many different projects, not just on Fantom, but across different chains, also connected with them as well. So there was a lot of trust in multi-chain. Obviously, in retrospect, maybe a bit too much trust, but there definitely was.
I think that's exactly the point, right? I think it's clear that multi-chain were reputable. They were used by many large chains. They were audited. They were a big provider. I guess the frustration with the community right now, from what I'm gauging in terms of the temperature, is that the lack of diversification. So if we go back to the wobble that happened a couple of months ago, it's recorded, and hindsight's a great thing, but I've got it recorded here where, when it happened, I said to the community, guys, stay away from these bridges, right? And that's obviously easier said than done, because many of the protocols, rely on those bridges, and there's not many other options for that Fantom ecosystem. So the question really comes back to, why were there not alternatives? Why were there not plan Bs and plan Cs in terms of viable bridge options for the ecosystem to use? And what's the plan to fix that going forward?
Yeah, so there were actually multiple bridges on the Fantom network for at least the past few months, and actually well beyond that, right? So for example, D-Bridge is a bridge that deployed on Fantom quite a while ago, right? So there have been multiple bridges available on Fantom for quite a while, right? Now, why is it the case that multi-chain though was responsible for the majority of the bridging on Fantom? Well, as I talked about a little bit earlier, I think it's because they had a very good reputation, not just from not just from a few individuals, but from across the community as a whole. And by the community, I mean the blockchain community. And number two is that they had the first mover advantage. They were the first bridge to integrate with Fantom and to bridge a lot of tokens back and forth. And so naturally, I think a lot of people just gravitated towards multi-chain particularly because of their reputation and their backing in the space, like for example by Binance Labs. And so a lot of people like trusted them, right? And when the other bridges came to Fantom a bit later, I can't remember the exact dates, but there were a number of bridges that came to Fantom. They just didn't get the same level of traction. One, probably because they weren't as well known as Multichain, and two, because Multichain had the first mover advantage, and three, to some extent, like Multichain was seen as quote unquote battle tested. Yep. They had processed a lot of transactions on their chain, on their protocol. They had done a lot of transactions, across multiple different chains, to the tune of billions of dollars. And people thought that, okay, well, they're really battle tested. They've done so many transactions. They must be very, very reliable. A lot of people are trusting them. Let's, gravitate and use them. So I think a lot of it has to do with the fact of like network effects, right? That really took place. And just to be clear, like Fantom Foundation and Multichain, to my knowledge, never had any sort of like contractual relationship or any sort of relationship where we said they were the exclusive chain, you should only use Multichain, or anything like that. And certainly we were never paid a dollar, to my knowledge, from Multichain ever, for integration or connection. It was, I think it was the fact that Multichain saw an opportunity, and obviously I think trusted Fantom because they trusted Andre being the common connection. Yep. That they wanted, and they saw the potential for Fantom, that they wanted to integrate with the Fantom chain very, very early on, and to take advantage of its growth, really.
So you're saying it's the kind of the usage of Multichain was very organic. People just kind of naturally gravitated towards the better, more audited, better use case platform. I understand. So you're saying that the other options always did exist. People just naturally weren't gravitating towards it. In hindsight, what could the foundation have done better, and what could we do better going forward to kind of safeguard protocols and get them to diversify their bridging activity a lot better? Like, do you think this is naturally going to be a lesson for them anyway, or is there anything that the foundation can do to kind of put some controls in place, perhaps?
Yeah, so I've obviously reflected about the events that have taken place and beforehand as well. And I think what has happened with Multichain was, to some extent, all right, a really, really, really unlucky situation to do with Multichain and the affected chains, including Fantom, right? The reason I say that is because there are other single points of failure to do with like other projects and protocols that are out there that some people may or may not be aware of, right? And that these single points of failure can lead to catastrophic consequences for the underlying chain, right? There have been other chains that I'm aware of that have had critical vulnerabilities where literally the entire chain could have been, destroyed or severely damaged, right? And I'm talking about like problems with consensus or confirming transactions, right? And to my knowledge, Fantom has never had one of those critical vulnerabilities, right? But it just so happens that those critical vulnerabilities on the other chains were first discovered by the good people rather than the bad people, right? Yep. But obviously, if they were discovered by the bad people first, the situation could be very different, right? And so in retrospect, you could say, oh, it was always like a time coming, like what happened with Multichain, couldn't you predict this and stuff? Well, remember, like a lot of projects and chains, trusted Multichain, and so we weren't necessarily, without the benefit of hindsight, knew that what had played out would have actually played out, right? That being said, some of the lessons learned are like, one, if the development team is based in, shall we say, like a jurisdiction where they can be put at risk, right? Then perhaps that's something to consider as like a risk factor in terms of like how much you're willing to like work with the chain, or like how much like projects should like trust the chain. That being said, like Fantom, as is the case with some other chains, it is a permissionless chain, so it's not like Multichain or any bridge or any project needs to have permission of the Fantom Foundation to deploy on chain. That's totally up to the project themselves deploying on chain and connecting to it. The Fantom Foundation doesn't really have a say in that. That being said, projects doing risk assessments and stuff may want to factor in the location, geographic location of where the developers are, right? Another thing that I thought about, which is kind of like hard to figure out, is that we now know that Zhao Zhen, by multi-chain teams like own statements, apparently had full control of the network to begin with, right? And why wasn't that known, right? Why wasn't it captured by all of the people who invested into Multichain? Apparently, why wasn't it apparently not known to like the auditors for the Multichain technology? It's quite hard to know about this, because sometimes this super privileged access isn't like really like so obvious, right? And one of the examples that I looked at recently that a friend of mine passed to me was the fact that apparently the C compiler, the C programming language compiler, had a backdoor for every single program that used the C compiler, right? And this backdoor was very hard to find because it was basically like tied up so much into the code that even if you were reviewing the code, it was very, very, very difficult to figure out that the backdoor was actually there, right? Where someone could get super privileged access, right? And the only reason it was found out is because the person who had the backdoor, which I think was an inadvertent backdoor, right, or inadvertent super privileged access, came clean about it and said, hey, I just want to disclose that, there's this like, super privileged access into all of these like programs that use the C compiler, which means that all of these, computers and stuff that run the Unix operating system have this backdoor, right? And the only reason why people don't really talk about it that much anymore is because, nothing really bad came out of it, right? And so there are situations where, people probably have super privileged access that we're not aware about, where you don't really care or you haven't really heard about it because it simply hasn't become an issue, right? And so the question is like, how do you figure out, who really has access behind, the validators and nodes? And my answer to that question is I'm not really sure, like what sort of due diligence you can do, because if you're just looking at, the validators, right? Like, you can see that, like X number of validators are running, Y number of validators and talking to one another, but who actually controls those validators behind it, right? Well, it can be hard to know unless you do some sort of like, like KYC or connecting information or just the validators itself with other like publicly known information to kind of like validate like who really controls the validators in the end. And so perhaps that's like what we need to do going forward, as kind of like a blockchain community, which is a lesson learned for like, us at the Fantom Foundation and also for like other chains that are out there. But it's not like a very easy question to answer, because the vulnerability was not, to my knowledge, to do with the MPC, right? It wasn't to do with the smart contracts in relation to this, right? It wasn't to do with the actual servers themselves. It was to do with this privileged access that Zhaojun had. Because if Zhaojun didn't have this privileged access, even though I believe that Zhaojun is detained, he wouldn't have been able to access the funds, right? Or the people who are detaining him wouldn't have been able to access the funds, I believe.
Yeah, and I can empathize with that. I mean, I think, particularly for you guys as a team, Fantom, to this day, it has prided itself on having near zero downtime, for being very secure. Like, this must have taken a toll on the team. Like, how's the morale of the team? How's the morale of yourself? I know from speaking to you before we jumped on this podcast here, like, it's been a tough time for you guys. You've had to pick up the mess of something which isn't directly involved with you, but clearly there's lessons to be learned and things the community, Fantom ecosystem could have done better. How's that been for the team?
Yeah, thanks for asking that question. Personally, I'm not going to say otherwise. It's been very, very hard. It's been very hard and very stressful, and it's been very hard on the team as well. What's been encouraging though at the team level is that everyone is 100% committed. In terms of moving forward. In terms of trying to resolve the situation as best as possible, and to come out of this and to be better out of it, right? And this is not the first challenge that Fantom has had or the Fantom ecosystem has had. We had a lot of struggles early on, as we talked about before. When we didn't even have a platform at the time, and things were not going well, and we overcame those challenges and succeeded to some extent in the end, I think. And this is another challenge. It's a very difficult challenge. I'm not going to say otherwise, but I think we can overcome it. And, it's not just like myself and the team that, are quite stressed out about the situation. It's also, protocols on the Fantom ecosystem. And I've had conversations with protocols in the Fantom ecosystem, and same with the team. And, they've been tough conversations, because obviously people have had a lot of money tied up in multi-chain.
On that note, I did hear one of the projects announcing they would have to shut down post this multi-chain saga. Can you speak to that? And are any other projects affected at this point critically?
Yeah, so there are a few projects on Fantom that have been hit by this, but are able to continue moving forward and want to continue moving forward. And we're trying to help them in various ways in order to be able to do that as a foundation. But you're right, there also has been a number of projects that have had to close down, and one of them is the Ijaz protocol, and that's because they were hit very, very hard by the multi-chain situation. And that's what like pains me a lot, is just like what has happened to protocols on Fantom, what has happened to what has happened in general as a result of this multi-chain situation, and the fact that there is, I believe, more than $200 million missing, not just from Fantom but across chains as a whole, and that to me is fundamentally wrong.
And it's not just a case of the money being missing, right? It's the impact it's had on the TVL flocking out of the ecosystem post the event as well. Because, like you said, there are avenues you're exploring to fill the gap and make people whole again, but that won't necessarily bring these projects back. It's TVL outflow, isn't it?
Yeah, so obviously, there has been like a lot of damage done to the reputation of the Fantom ecosystem or the Fantom Foundation, and that will be hard to recover, right? It's often been said that it takes it can take a while for a good reputation to be built, and very quickly it can be damaged, right? And clearly, the Fantom reputation of the ecosystem, the foundation, has been damaged as a result of the multi-chain situation. I'm not going to say otherwise. The point I'm trying to make here is that as difficult as things are, we have to find like solutions to the problem and figure out like how to move forward together, right? And there have been other chains that are out there that have also had very, very difficult circumstances before. Like the one that I can think like more recently was Solana and the collapse of FTX. Obviously, that severely impacted their community, and it was very, very difficult for them.
I do want to jump in on there because like I've spoken a lot about Solana on the channel as well. And there's a big difference for those who are listening to this podcast. It's not me defending Fantom, it's just stating the facts. Solana's having multiple outages, right, in that period, multiple outages on their native blockchain. This is a bridge exploit. This is completely different, right? And I think it's important to add that nuance. I think, this particularly with Fantom ecosystem priding themselves on the security and their lack of downtime, for this to tarnish them from a bridge exploit, which we know is the attack vector. We've always known that as a crypto community. I can ask you maybe later here in our chat here, what can the crypto community do in terms of, nullifying this attack vector? Like, what is the options? Because bridges don't seem to be working. All the biggest hacks are happening from bridges. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so well, as I mentioned before, there have been critical vulnerabilities with like underlying the underlying technology of like other chains, right? But I wouldn't necessarily get into the details about those. But to do with Solana, and the outages, yes, it's true that they've had a bunch of outages in the past. But like what I was kind of like more referring to was the fact that Solana was intertwined with FTX quite a lot. Obviously, they're not the same, and I just want to be very clear. Like I have no evidence whatsoever that anybody from the Solana team at all did anything like improper or anything like that. I just want to make that clear. Like I to my knowledge, I don't think that's the case at all. But that being said, the Solana ecosystem obviously depended on for example, like Alameda or FTX for liquidity for a lot of their pegged assets like Sol BTC and Sol ETH, and obviously a lot of TVL was dependent on FTX and Alameda. And when FTX and Alameda collapsed, obviously all of that came out very, very quickly, right? And they went through a very difficult time, for like a month or two, but they managed to recover from it, right? Because they rallied as a community. I think the foundation, you have to give them credit, like worked hard in overcoming this, and they were able to like, continue to thrive, right? And I think for Fantom, we have a challenge where, a lot of projects on Fantom were reliant or interacted with the multi-chain protocol. Obviously, the multi-chain protocol is no longer working, and so there's been a lot of like damage done to the Fantom ecosystem. And so now we need to figure out what do we do going forward, right? And how do we overcome the challenges? And I think we can overcome these challenges because it's been done before, and we've had other challenges in Fantom. We've overcome them, and the team is working very, very hard. No one's quit or anything like that.
Yep.
And so I think we're all of like the same opinion in the Fantom Foundation about, you know, having to move forward as best as we can.
So just a few more questions here, looking backwards before we switch the stance and start talking about the future and how we move on from this episode. To what extent was the Fantom's funds affected? How much did Fantom lose in this situation? How much do you have tied up in this multi-chain?
Yeah, so the good news is that the Fantom Foundation has like quite a decent runway. So we do have time on our side in terms of like building out the new technology and rolling out improvements and that sort of thing, you know, which we can get into. So the Fantom Foundation was most impacted in terms of its finances by the value of the multi-chain tokens that we hold, called the multi-token, right? You know, we were, you know, one of the parties that bought a whole bunch of multi-tokens, you know, to the tune of millions of dollars. We staked a lot of it. A lot of it was also put into the multi/ETH pool that Andre withdrew before in like late May or early June because he wanted to avoid impermanent loss. You know, but we held on to those tokens, and the tokens that are locked, you know, I think they're locked for like another, if I'm not mistaken, like 1 or 2 years or something like that. You know, those can't be accessed as well. And so, you know, we had long-term investments related to multi-chain, and obviously the value of the multi-chain token, you know, is a fraction of what it was before, right? Because the multi-chain, you know, protocol like essentially doesn't exist or is not operational at the moment, right? So that has been the most direct financial impact to the you know,
what dollar amount would you put on that?
Well, it depends on like, you know, the price of like the multi-chain token, like different points in time. But, you know, broadly speaking, compared to say like, you know, 2 or 3 months ago, we've lost like a few $1 million. Yeah.
Okay.
So
let's put that into perspective, because I've seen a few different kind of numbers floating around here. Of course, after Andre's tweet, and then you did another podcast appearance. Like, what is the Fantom runway looking like? I mean, the last we heard 30-year runway, right? This many 100 million. Give us the latest. What are we looking at in terms of runway?
Well, you know, the runway like depends upon like, you know, like how much you spend, how much income you get in, and that sort of thing, right? In terms of the runway, yeah, it is like very, very long, right? In terms of like the current expenditure, right? So I think we spend a lot less than other chains that are out there. You know, like the total number of employees at Fantom is around 50. I know for other chains that are out there, I think it in numbers in around like a few hundred. So we do like run the foundation, I guess, like more lean than other projects that are out there.
Would you say it's still around 30 years in your head? Is that about the right number?
Like at current expenditure levels, yeah, that is like pretty much the case, right? And all of the money that we have is like more like conservative investments that you do, like bonds and property and stable coins and farming and, you know, and curve bribes and that sort of thing. So we utilize the money that we have to generate returns, and then the returns are used to pay, you know, the expenses of the foundation, right? So
and how would you compare that 30-year runway to some other projects if you were to kind of estimate how other projects?
Well, I can't comment on you know the amount of, you know, funds that other, you know, chains or projects have out there, simply because I don't really know. You know, maybe I have an idea here and there from like what I've heard from different people, but, you know, nothing like definitive or nothing that I can like really comment on. So I don't really know about like other chains that are out there. All I can do is,
if you were to give yourself a score as a project on your runway, what score would you give yourself, 1 to 10?
like in terms of like sustainability, like
runway, financial runway. Like, do you ever wake up worried that we're going to run out of money as CEO of Fantom?
No, I'm not worried about that at all. No.
It's lower down on your priority list. You're comfortable. That's what I'm trying to get at.
yeah. Well, like, you know, as I just explained, you know, we have a decent amount of runway to continue developing it, and that's good news, right? You know,
and this multi-chain issue has not affected you. You're talking a couple of million versus a much larger number in terms of.
As I've just said before, right? You know, we took a hit primarily with the value of the multi-token, right? And there was also some FTM tokens stuck on the bridge as well, but that wasn't like as much as like the value of the multi-token itself, right? But in terms of like financial sustainability, in terms of all our other assets and how much we're spending and our ability to develop, yeah, that hasn't really been impacted, right? And so the good news for us is not like, oh, we only have like 6 months of runway or 1 year or 2 years of runway, and, you know, we really need to like develop and launch technology and get more traction within a period of time, or we're just out of funds, right? The good news is that we don't have that kind of pressure. Not to say that we can be comfortable and like, just like trug along and not really that do much for the next like few years or so. But what I'm saying is that we do have like the funding there to continue the development of the Fantom virtual machine, of the new storage system, of the new Rust client, of working with like the founders of Aragon. All of that work continues as normal. All of the current work at the foundation continues as normal. And in fact, we are actually hiring even additional people. As I mentioned before, like we're hiring a new CMO with a lot of outside experience to come in and help us with the branding and the marketing going forward, because I think that is something that we've really lacked in the past, that we should have paid more attention to, I admit, and we will be paying more attention to it as well going forward.
And I want to come on to that. We are definitely going to move on to the future now. Last question here on the multi-chain saga, and we'll keep things moving. So if you were hypothetically, I'm saying hypothetically because I know you don't want to commit to this, if you were hypothetically required to dive into your funds to cover off those affected, what impact, if any, would that have on your runway? Would that give you would that be a significant financial blow, or is it something you feel like you could absorb?
It really depends on like how much and over like what period of time, right?
So if it was the totality, the 60-70 million of the Fantom affected, right? Of the $1 million.
Well, I don't know if we'll be able to like, give away that amount of money, or even if that would be like sensible, given the circumstances.
Okay, let's switch stances. So then let's discuss now what the road looks like onwards, right? So we know the trust has taken a hit. We've spoken about that. TVL has dissipated. Projects are in disarray and starting to lose belief in the Fantom ecosystem, right? We know that. So what concrete steps are you, as CEO of Fantom, now going to put in place to really start building that confidence back, to bring TVL back in? Which bridges can start to fill the void? How are you thinking about the road back from here now?
Yeah, so even before like the whole multi-chain situation played out, there were other bridges that were looking to come to Fantom, right? And to get some traction there. So those bridges were the Axeler bridge and also the Layer 0 bridge, right? And so they've started to get traction. I think they've managed to get like a few $1 million in, since they launched about like 2 or 3 weeks ago or so. I can't remember the exact date. And so like they're getting a little bit of traction, and they're having like all sorts of different campaigns, and they're working very closely with a number of projects on Fantom. I think, they're not, based in, to my knowledge, based in jurisdictions that, would have the same issues as multi-chain. That being said, I can't guarantee that, there will never be any issues with those bridges whatsoever, although they are like quite well known and quite like well respected as well. And they don't have the same sort of like geographic issues as say like multi-chain has, let's just say it like that, right? But in terms of like development going forward, so what is the game plan, right? So the game plan is Fantom virtual machine and the new storage system, they are completed, right? And what we're doing right now is that we're testing in a private demo net. So this is kind of like a test net, but in private. And that is running right now. And we are looking at the results, and the results are looking very promising, right? So for example, in terms of like reduction of storage, what we're seeing right now is a 97 to 98% reduction in the storage requirements for running a node, right? Now that is huge, because it means that your ability to run a node, to sync it, and the cost of running the node, and it is far more efficient than it was in the past, right? So I do really think that this technology is revolutionary. We've had significant increases in throughput as well, although that kind of like, peters off a little bit as you add more nodes to the network, which is normal. And we're now planning to optimize that. We've made other optimizations to consensus as well in relation to this new technology that's coming out. And so the plan is, having talked to Bernard, just I think about like 12 hours ago, is that in about 2 months, it will be possible to launch a public mainnet with this new technology. So people themselves would be able to like play around with the technology, and we would invite a lot of projects, on the Fantom ecosystem or outside the Fantom ecosystem to come in and play around with the new testnet, right? And you can see the real technology take place, and you can see the difference in terms of performance and storage requirements to run a node, right? And so that's very important for us, because that will be like the first practical example of this technology that I know I've been talking around for a while now, that's been under development for a while, actually come to fruition, right? And then after a period of time with the testnet, assuming everything goes well, then we'll be looking to deploy that in terms of the mainnet, right? And so that is the game plan for us, technologically speaking. And I think it will have dramatic improvements to the underlying Fantom technology. And the reason why we're working on this technology, as I mentioned in another podcast, right, is not because, it's a dick measuring contest, right? Or we're just doing it for ego or technology's sake. The reason why is because it has very, very serious practical benefits for the end user, right? So higher throughput means that you can run really popular applications on the Fantom network, and you're less likely to get bottlenecks. I know we had bottlenecks in the past, and same with other chains, but this helps avoid it, right? So the other thing that it enables is that you can run nodes far more cheaply and and sync a lot faster than in the past, right? And so that means that if you want to run a validator, it becomes far more easier. If you want to run like an RVC node, right, or an API-based node, it becomes far easier. And so the ability for projects to interact with the Fantom network just becomes a lot easier from this new technology, right? So I do think it will make a world of difference to Fantom. And what we need to do is be able to market that successfully and to engage in various BD initiatives. So the BD initiatives are like the gas monetization project. So what that is a similar monetization to say what YouTube has, which is basically the more transactions that your application gets, the more money that you earn as a share of the transaction fees, right? So right now we've been running the gas monetization for, I think, between 2 to 3 months. And we've already been able to generate, I think, about 120, 130,000 US dollars, worth of like Fantom for these projects, right? And this is the very early days of the program, right? And so that encourages people to want to build popular applications on Fantom, because it means that they actually have an additional income stream, not just from the application themselves, but from simply generating transactions on the application, right? And so that is an initiative that we've seen get a bit of traction. And then there's other ideas about like gas abstraction, where if you want to onboard users, and they don't necessarily have like Fantom already to pay transaction fees, you're able to pay the transaction fees for the users themselves. And we've also engaged with some like well-known companies as well that we want to do some like announcements with. So there's like a number of like different like BD initiatives that we're starting to roll out, which we can combine with the new technology that's coming out. And this is how I think we make a comeback. And with the new marketing person we're coming in, we want to do a significant rebrand for Fantom to really emphasize like the benefits of the new technology and how it really is like very, very different from the current Fantom technology that we have.
Got it. Thank you for the update. And look, those were some of the features I wanted to kind of discuss, and you already covered them off for me. So good to get an update on the gas monetization and the storage solution. Both, great pieces of technology. I think we've never had a question really in terms of what you guys at Fantom are building from a technical perspective. I guess a lot of the questions always, as we've spoken about this in the past, is about when marketing. I guess now we almost need to change the question to now say when trust as well, because it's the trust element that's also starting to dissipate. And so my question to you really is, yes, you've got these amazing features, you've got this great tech stack, fast block finality. Yeah, great, all great. How do you attract two types of people, two avatars? One, a user who wants to use a DeFi protocol, who's seen what's happened with Multichain and goes, I just don't want to touch that chain right now. And two, the dApp developer who can build another dApp, who can build on ETH layer 2, who can build on Solana, who can build on Avalanche, who can build another stack. How do you get the buy-in for those two audiences now?
Yeah, so trust is an important factor, like obviously when it comes to developers, because developers not only care about performance and being able to run the application, they care about the safety of the assets for sure, right? Yeah. And bridges do have like a risk to it, just like all technology has a risk to it. So the question is like, how do you kind of like minimize it, right? So obviously one way is to have like kind of like a native like issued a stable coin on a particular chain, right? And actually Andre is working on figuring out how to do that. And there'll be further details being shared there. And there will be like a native stable coin to Fantom, which will be a fix or a significant improvement over like the FUSD at the moment, which was a mistake on the foundation's part not to add liquidations when we should have, I think back in 2020 or 2021. So we learned the lesson from that. The other thing is, bridge diversification. So as I mentioned before, there's there's multiple bridges in Fantom, and the two that have recently come are Layer 0 and Axler. And people need to make the decision as like which bridge they choose, and how they want to interact with the bridge. And layer 0, for example, is like a very, very and full disclosure, like Fantom Foundation is an investor into Layer 0. Layer 0 is a very well-known protocol that is already connected with like many other different chains, and it definitely has a lot of interest, like from the community, from the blockchain community. So people have different bridging solutions. Stablecoin on Fantom. Perhaps will there be like Circle and Tether and other like stablecoins natively issued on Fantom at some point in time? Maybe. I very much hope so. I think that would greatly benefit Fantom users, and I think also benefit Circle and like Tether themselves. So I think that's how you kind of like find solutions to these kind of problems. But one thing I do want to make very clear is that there's no such thing as like risk-free when it comes to technology, right? It's all just about like risk minimization. And as I mentioned before, there are a number of single points of failure, like with other chains, and sometimes they have critical vulnerabilities, and those vulnerabilities, luckily have been discovered by the good guys rather than the bad guys. So the entire blockchain ecosystem, I think, in some respects, is more fragile than people realize, right? And obviously, we saw like the fragility with Multichain, which was very unfortunate and very unlucky there. But there are other like aspects that are also like fragile as well that I think can be addressed. But there definitely are like it's definitely not risk-free technology, and it kind of makes sense because all of this technology is kind of new, right? Like none of this stuff existed a few years ago, let alone 10 years ago or 20 years ago, right? Like all of this stuff is new, it's just a few years old. And I think that's what some people would like forget about, right? And so obviously with new technology, there's a lot of new opportunity and a lot of new things that, people can do with it. But also at the same time, there's like new risk with new technology, just because it's so new and, it hasn't had the longevity of being battle tested, right? So that's why all of this new technology is not risk-free, and people need to be aware of that, and need to take that into account, just as like a general theme.
Got it. And so with that in mind, is there any update on the Fantom stablecoin and other native stablecoins? So you mentioned there USDC, USDT. Is there any concrete progress there or roadmap that we can look towards seeing those assets on the Fantom blockchain?
Andre is working on like the new native stablecoin for Fantom. I don't really want to give more details than that for the time being. And in terms of like native issuance with like Circle and Tether, we've talked to them in the past. They haven't integrated with Fantom yet. We would obviously like them to do it, but I don't really have any more like details than that.
Got it. But it's a priority.
But like, yeah, definitely we would like that for sure, 100%.
And I guess you spoke there about, crypto obviously not being a riskless ecosystem. Of course, you have to take risks. I guess the traffic and people will flow to wherever the best perceived risk management is and risk mitigation. So with kind of what's happened with the multi-chain debacle here, what risk management processes, what the community's been asking, what risk management processes are currently in place now, or you're going to put in place actively to make sure this kind of stuff doesn't happen again, to make sure we're, Fantom is industry leading in terms of their risk management and risk avoidance?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned before, like to some extent, like what is happening with Multichain was like a very, very, very unlucky situation. That being said, there are lessons to be learned from it, as I answered before, right? And, in terms of risk management is, having that like bridge diversity, right? It's about like, like having your own stable coin on the network. But even then, like, with chains with like native issuance or even have like own native stable coin, yes, that does like help in terms of like reducing risk, right? But there are still bridges being used, right? Like there are a lot of bridges there are a number of bridges that are used by all of the popular chains, right? That transact in like billions of dollars on a daily or like a monthly basis, and that have access to a lot of funds, right? So all the major chains out there utilize bridges a lot, right? And so it's not like it's just stable coins, you have negative issuance, and then ta-da, you have no bridge risk whatsoever, right? It just like minimizes like the level of risk or the amount of money that could be potentially lost in a bridge exploit, right? Yep. So in terms of like bridging technology, I think what people need to like kind of like focus on, right? And I don't have much technical knowledge when it comes to like how bridges work, to be honest, right? That hasn't really been my background. But thinking about who controls the nodes, how the nodes come to consensus, how the transactions are processed is very important. And also to do with the smart contracts, have they been audited? Have they been validated? Have they used tools out there to help validate the security and safety of the smart contracts that are interacting with the bridges? That's something else also to consider as well. So I think if you take all of those factors in consideration, you can reduce risk a lot. But fundamentally, because of the amount of assets that are held on chain and going through bridges, they are always like honeypots, and they're always something that is there's always like risk there, right? And this is why like the Fantom Foundation spends a lot of its time simply just testing the software that we push out there, right? So as you mentioned before, right, there hasn't really been like many issues with the Fantom chain, right? There's been, to my knowledge, no critical vulnerabilities. The consensus has been working even during this whole multi-chain debacle, or during like other periods of time of like high traffic. The Fantom network has continued to operate, and that's because we focus very, very much on security, right? Because we know that the security to the chain is absolutely fundamental, right? As Bernard like said to me before, the importance of security, for the underlying chain and for smart contracts is the equivalent of like security for like the space shuttle or for space vehicles, right? In other words, there can be no, you have to take like a very serious like zero tolerance approach, right?
Yep.
So the fact that we've had good results with the Fantom technology, I think speaks a lot to the team and how much focus they are on security. And so on our end, we will continue to take security very, very seriously, which is why that even though like the Fantom virtual machine technology and the storage system are ready, and we could theoretically roll it out very, very quickly to the mainnet, the reason we haven't done that is because we need to make sure that it's very, very much tested, because a lot of it is at stake, right? Like everything that will be running on Fantom will be running on this new technology, right? And so, if you try and do as much due diligence as possible on security, I think that's what like I'm trying to say here.
Yeah.
But you never get a risk, but you can minimize the risk. Yeah.
Absolutely. And this conversation actually reminds me of a book called The Black Box Thinking. Don't know if you've read it, but it's by a guy called, I think it's Malcolm Gladwell. And it's a message really for the whole industry, really, which is that he spoke about how they managed to take the aerospace industry, right? So airlines, and take one of the inherently most dangerous methods of transport, and over decades turned it into one of the most safest. And the way they did that is whenever there was a catastrophic failure, whenever there was a situation that went wrong, they ruthlessly and relentlessly dissect why it happened and made sure that exact same fault would not happen thereafter. And they would share that knowledge to all the other airlines. I think it's a message for the wider crypto community as well, is when these situations happen, when these bridge attacks happen, when there's downtime on a blockchain, we should relentlessly study why. Why did it happen? What went wrong? And share that, disseminate that knowledge across to other chains, so that as an industry we can get stronger and we can learn from these and go from what many in TradFi are calling the wild, wild west into something which is really safe and secure and brings confidence and trust of people to put their hard-earned money into. That's ultimately what we need. What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, I totally agree with what you're saying there. I think that's a good parallel to draw. As I mentioned before, this is all new technology, right? It's only a few years old, right? So, it's no surprise that, there's been like security incidences, and, sometimes like networks have gone down, as you mentioned before, and there's been like other issues, right? Because, whenever there's new technology, like as you mentioned before, like with new airplanes, it's not likely that, the first iteration is necessarily like the best iteration or the safest iteration, and then all the hard work is done now, and we don't really need to do any like more research and development, right? But that obviously is not the case, right? It's very, very complicated. It's an iterative approach, and it takes a bit of time. And so we always learn internally about like, what's the best way to test? How do we test this software? What could go wrong? Okay, let's look at like how things have gone wrong in the past, and let's try and avoid that going forward. And and we can talk about this, for example, in the context of smart contracts, because I did like a bunch of smart contract security research back in like 2016 and 2017, and the way that we approached it is that we basically took into account vulnerabilities that were known, right? And we studied those vulnerabilities, and we tried to figure out, okay, how do these vulnerabilities work? How do we kind of like create software that can automatically find those sorts of patterns or vulnerabilities in smart contracts, and to run automated testing, right? Or what we call like static program analysis. And so, that approach was really based upon like learning from the mistakes of others, right? Yeah. So for example, like in 2016, there was something called like the DAO hack, and there was like, I can't remember the amount of ETH, but like tens of thousands of ETH that were stolen from the smart contract. And it turns out it's because of a specific exploit called reentrancy, right? And people back then didn't really know that, this exploit called reentrancy was really possible. It just wasn't known, right? But then we learned that it was known after studying this attack. And so, there's a lot of like software checking, I think like a lot of like auditors now, software that like automatically like checks or analyzes smart contracts will take into account like the reentrancy exploit going forward, right? And so we can learn from the mistakes in the past and ruthlessly like try and make things better, right? Just like with the airplane, right? There were crashes and stuff, and crashes still happen, like obviously, right? But they happen far less than it was in the past, right? Your risk of dying in an aircraft now is like, it's something that it's not zero, obviously, but it's something that you really like don't even really need to think about, right? Yeah. And ultimately we want to get into a situation where we have security as close to zero as possible, and we have to learn from the failures of the past, right? Whether it's the failures to do with like multi-chain, as I talked about, or the failures to do with smart contracts, or any sort of like technical failures. It's something that we can really learn about and try and not make the same mistake again.
Thank you for that. So just conscious, we've been running now for an hour and 20 here. So just want to quickly rapid fire through some of the last few questions the community have gathered here for us. So if we can just rapid fire through these ones. So obviously recently the community voted to reduce the validator requirements, right? Validator requirements. Can you explain what this means for the ecosystem and why you believe this is a positive step for Fantom and how people can get involved?
Yeah, so on the Fantom, in terms of like the number of validators in the Fantom network, I think the number is around like 60 or 61 last time I checked. What we want to do, we kind of discussed internally, is that we want to get maybe around 200 to 300 validators like running on the network, right? Ideally in the long term, right? Now, there's no like easy answer as to like what level of decentralization is a good level of decentralization, right? There's no mathematical answer to that. It's more of a philosophical question, right? And for us internally, the number we're kind of thinking about is like 200 to 300, right? So if we want to reduce the validator stake ideally to as low as possible, right? Like say like 1 FTM, and maybe that will occur over time. And part of that being able to like handle more validators is basically implementing new technology, right? So as I talked about before, this is why it's so important, the Fantom virtual machine, the changes in the storage, and the improvements to consensus, because all of that will enable us to run, like 200 to 300 validators and get very, very good performance. Like I think the Fantom network right now could actually be capable of running 200 to 300 validators, but obviously there will be some slowdown in performance, right? And also the amount of like storage required to run a validator and the complexity of it due to the amount of storage, it is actually like relatively complicated. So for example, like when you're running a validator now, that's an RPC node, right? You have to have like 12 or 13 terabytes of data, enormous amount of data. Well, if you can cut that to a fraction of it, then running an RPC API nodes, your own API nodes, just becomes significantly cheaper because you don't have to pay for all of this storage, right? And the time it takes for you to sync your node, it just becomes a fraction because the amount of like space that's taken up is a fraction, right? And so if you're like like dramatically reducing the amount of storage requirements for like the validator nodes, right? So then your ability to run a validator node and cost of it just becomes so much easier, right? And so what we want to do over time is lower the validator requirements, or have the community lower the validator requirements, increase the network the performance such that we get to say 200 to 300 validators, people can run it affordably, and the network just kind of like runs really, really well. That's what we're looking to do.
Got it. And for the average layperson watching here who's sat on a few Fantom, they want to spin up a validator node, what's it going to cost them today? How many Fantom? how quick is it easy? How quick and easy is it for them to set up a validator node? I did message you because we do need to set up a little episode where we can show people how easy it is to set up a validator.
Yeah.
And obviously, what would their rewards be at this current point in time?
So the rewards when you lock it up for about 12 months is approximately, in terms of Fantom, like around 6% annualized yield. In terms of the cost of running a validator, I mean, like obviously, like costs vary depending on like what provider you use and that sort of thing. But I've heard people in the community say that they've been able to run a node for the cost of around 500 or 600, roughly speaking, US dollars per month, which is not actually that high when you think about like the kind of requirements at the moment. That being said, you know,
and what are the requirements at the moment? 50,000, I believe.
Sorry. Well, there's minimum staking requirements, but like I'm talking like there's also the economic requirements as well, right? Which is why like the minimum staking requirement to some extent is not really that important, right? Because
it's not economical.
If you're just running a node at a loss, it doesn't really make sense, right?
So what's the calculation to break even then economically? Then what are we talking in terms of Fantom?
Yeah, so as I just mentioned before, like a couple of people in the community say that they've been able to run their nodes, validated nodes, for about 500 to 600 roughly US dollars per month. I think it's a little bit higher now because of like inflation and increase in cost, devaluation of our currency. But that's running with the current technology, right? So if we're running with the new technology where the storage should be a fraction of what it is right now, and it's more efficient, the cost should be, lower than that, right? So it's not too expensive to run, a validated node. You don't need to have insane requirements, but there is definitely a cost there. And any way we can minimize the cost as much as possible, it just makes it more economically viable and sensible to run a validator yourself.
Just running the maths there, if you're talking about 500 quid, $500, let's use dollars instead of my pounds here. If you're talking about $500 return at 6%, you need at least $8,300. But obviously, there's a minimum of 50,000 you need to be staking. Is that correct?
Yeah. So I'm not going to do the maths off the top of my head, but it's 500 to 600. What is that like annualized?
Yeah.
$6,700. Sorry, $6,000 to $7,000. Yeah. I mean, you will need to have you'll need to be running a decent amount of FTM plus the delegated FTM to at least cover the cost to kind of like even. Otherwise, it doesn't.
It's definitely exciting. It's getting more and more approachable for people, and I've sensed in the community more and more people are kind of interested and looking to explore setting up a validator node now that the prices have started to come. The minimum stake has really started to come down. Okay, so let's keep things moving. What are your thoughts on the XRP judge verdict and how Fantom would stand to claims it is a security? Good question by the community.
Yeah. So I'm not a lawyer. I can't really give like a legal answer to what the ruling is. Although I have like looked at it kind of like briefly, I think what a lot of people in the community have been saying is that the ruling overall is like very, very good, right? Because what the ruling says, my understanding, right? Again, I'm not a lawyer, right? So don't take any of this as legal advice or my legal opinion, right? As a layperson, what it looks like is that the Ripple did lose in terms of like their sales to institutions were considered to be securities, but everything else in terms of activities related to the XRP token was not considered to be securities. And then fundamentally, the XRP token, based on its like characteristics and how it works, is itself not a security, right? Now, I think that's a very good outcome, for the community, because I think it adds a bit of like clarity as to like what could and could not be seen as like security related activities in relation to the US. That being said, this is not like a final ruling necessarily. This is not like a like Supreme Court ruling or anything like that, where it's at the final stage. It's possible that the SEC could like appeal it. They could appeal it in part. They could appeal it, in its entirety. Ripple could also appeal the part of their judgment that they lost. My understanding is that there's also like a jury trial now as to like the aspect of like the part of the case that they lost as to like the jury's opinion on it. So we've got to see how that plays out. But overall, I think the ruling is quite good for the industry, and that's certainly how the industry perceives it. But again, like I think there's still a lot of regulatory uncertainty out there. We need to figure out, we need to have like I guess kind of like more rulings. We need to have Congress ideally put in place, into law, particular legislation that makes it very definitively clear, what the regulatory landscape is. And I know that the Congress, or at least the House of Representatives, have various proposals that are put forward. I know there have been a couple of proposals in the Senate that have been put forward as well on both sides of the aisle, as they say, that kind of have gotten stuck. So I think a lot of it also comes down to politics. And I do think in general, Republicans seem to be a lot more pro digital assets or sensible when it comes to digital assets regulations compared to the Democrats. Although, on both sides, there are like different opinions. And, there are some like Democrats who also like are kind of like pro digital assets, right? But on the whole, like, I think if there is a Republican president in 2024 elected, as well as a Republican Senate, I think you could have a lot of really good regulatory outcomes. That being said, it's kind of a bit speculative what I'm saying, but that's just kind of my opinion.
Cool. Thank you for that. You spoke earlier about the introduction of a new marketing personnel within the team. Can you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, so we've been working with a couple of recruiters for the past few months now, and Andre and I have interviewed a lot of different candidates, and these are candidates that we specifically asked for not to have prior crypto experience or not to have much knowledge about the blockchain industry, at least to begin with, right?
What credentials are you looking for? Sorry to interrupt, Mike.
Yeah. So it sounds a bit counterintuitive. It's like, well, wait a second. This is a job, this is a job related, to blockchain marketing, that sort of thing. Why do you want to hire someone who specifically doesn't have that experience? So the reason why is because we already have a lot of people inside the foundation that, have been living and breathing, the blockchain industry and have been living in the space. And, and to some extent, we have like kind of like our opinions about certain things. What we want to do is we want to have someone else without a lot of outside experience to come in and kind of like tell us from their perspective, how they think like our brand is perceived as, and how they think that blockchain brands are perceived as, and to help us work with it, right? And so, we want to hire someone with that a very different knowledge set to what we have at the moment, right? So some of the people that we've talked to are candidates that have worked in senior marketing or chief marketing roles, in entertainment industry, in gaming industry, in the technology industry, and we want to have their experience that we don't have in the team as a whole to come in and work with us to combine our experiences together, right? So there's one candidate that I think we're very close to hiring. He'll be able to join us maybe in a couple of months or so. And he's someone that has a lot of experience in the entertainment industry, a lot of experience marketing for gaming, kind of like turning brands around and that sort of thing. And he has really gone up to speed since I've talked to him about, understanding more about Fantom and the blockchain industry. And it's really just him, going out there and just like learning himself, right? Which is very good. It's a very good sign of, self-learning and that sort of thing, using his own initiative. And we use a recruiter because your recruiter is able to validate the background, right? Is able to do like a whole bunch of like, checking, getting a whole bunch of references to make sure that their background really is as they say it is. And so we are very confident that his background is real. He seems to communicate very well. He has a lot of ideas, and I think the right background for us to really rejig our marketing. Because I think one of the weak points for Fantom, as was mentioned before, is that we haven't really been able to take advantage of marketing the technology that we have at the moment, marketing like the Fantom ecosystem and the benefits of the Fantom ecosystem and why we are different from the other chains that are out there. And so what this new marketing guy will do will help us really work on that branding, because to be perfectly honest, I don't have the solutions or ideas in my head, nor does Andre, nor I think the rest.
Nor should you, right? Because you guys should be focused on the tech, rightly so, and the rest other parts of the business. But I guess it's interesting because there's a lot of parallels with, Algorand. I hate to say it, but you talk about Algorand, and they faced a lot of marketing challenges as well. They went outfield, they looked at TradFi, they brought in somebody, ex-Jacob Morgan, TradFi, Stacey Warden. And you look at the parallels, and obviously now they're struggling. You saw what they're doing lately in terms of their stake and their validators. But this is a piece of the puzzle that has to be figured out, right? And it's got to be just as much a priority as the tech platform. Is that how it's being treated internally?
Yeah, you're exactly right, because like ultimately, like Fantom Foundation, like obviously we work in a lot of technology, right? But the entire purpose of the Fantom Foundation is to grow and develop the Fantom ecosystem, right? And so what does that entail? Obviously, it entails technology, right? Because, you know, without technology, you have no platform anyway. But it's not just technology, right? It's about launching the platform, so you have kind of like your platform or your product, right? And then getting users to use that technology and to understand the benefits of why they want to use that technology or what they want to deploy on the platform, right? And so, you know, it's kind of like BD/marketing plus tech combined is what we really need to focus on. Is really those two broad categories, in my opinion. So on the tech side, I think we've done a pretty good job, if I may say so. I think the results of the chain, you know, not really having issues kind of speaks for itself. We've hired a lot of really smart people on the technology side that have like really specialized knowledge in consensus, in virtual machines and compilers. Like for example, like Bernard Schultz is a full professor at the University of Sydney, and his entire background for the past 20 or 30 years has specifically been on virtual machines, on, you know, programming languages, storage systems, and that sort of thing. And so he's bringing his very specialized knowledge to solve these very specialized technical problems.
Yep.
On the marketing side, it's about like, okay, how do we take all this technology and say to people, okay, this technology really does matter for you as the end user because you're able to run apps, you know, dApps a lot more efficiently, because you're able to handle a lot more users, because the user experience in terms of time to confirm transactions is a lot less, right?
Yep.
And because it's a lot easier to run servers and that sort of thing. So that's what we really need to communicate to people. And I think that's like the challenge for us with Fantom. I think part of it is also because Andre and myself, we don't have a marketing background. I don't have any like formal experience in marketing. I never worked in a marketing role. We all just kind of have tech backgrounds. And so we always like have viewed things in terms of tech and just thinking like, oh, you know, tech is just what matters. Do the tech, everything else will just fall into line automatically. And I think that's proven not necessarily to be true.
I mean, if tech itself mattered, Ethereum wouldn't be the biggest layer one, would they? I mean, we know and that's the reality. It's got to balance with the use cases, and it's got to balance with people using it, which is why Solana continues to do well, because people are still, you know, they've used it, they've onboarded and they've used it, and they've had a gateway through to using the ecosystem. I think that's what needs to be pushed for the Fantom ecosystem. Okay, so let's keep this moving. There's a question here from the community: will Fantom be part of the next cohort for the Chainlink CCIP? So of course they launched their interoperability protocol the other day. Are there any talks going on with the Chainlink team around that? Could you be part of the next cohort?
I'm not sure about that. Like, I hope we are part of the next cohort. I saw that they just released on a few like test nets. So yeah, we'll definitely be open to that. You know, I am speaking at the Chainlink Smart Con Summit.
Okay.
I think that's in October. But yeah, definitely would be interested in being part of like the CCIP infrastructure.
Got it. And there was another question around
particularly with the new technology we've got coming out. Yeah.
Got it. And there's another question around the externally owned accounts. Are they multi-sig or are they not? Can we get to the bottom of this? So there's some people on Twitter claiming that the owner of this contract can change the bytecode of any address on the network, so it could just update the SFC to ignore the owner, etc. Is that the case? What's that?
Yeah. So in relation to the SFC, right? That is a multi-signature contract with 3 parties, right? With regards to the address that's listed, I think in part of like the Go Opera repository, I think it's got like node auth or something like is the name of the variable, right? I have spoken to the team about that, and I think I'm hoping that we can remove that. I think that's like an old, like kind of like artifact from the code that maybe we kind of like overlooked in the past. It's more related to like the way that the SFC works, but we think that it might not be actually necessary, right? So I'm speaking to the team about potentially removing that, and if we can remove that, I would definitely like to remove that when we can. So I'll receive further updates from the team, and once that's been updated, we'll definitely let the community know about it.
So ignore my ignorance on this. Is it multi-sig? Is it not? Like, can transactions currently be reversed and take control of validation?
Yeah, so the SSC is multi-sig. The wallet associated with that node auth variable is not multi-sig at the moment. We could make it multi-sig. That's very easy to do, actually. But ideally, we want to remove it because I think it's an old artifact of the code that we don't really need at the moment. Yeah.
Got it. And then another question which cropped up a lot was, Are there any further talks with Coinbase regarding a listing? And I guess the question comes up because, we know that the US really went ahead with the Operation Choke Point this year. Gary Gensler's been after crypto. It's been really, really hard for a lot of the US users to really on-ramp onto crypto, and even more so to on-ramp onto Fantom. There are not many places. I think I'm speaking to a few US users in our Discord community, and I think they just got, is it Kraken and probably crypto.com? That's the only two gateways to get Fantom for a centralized exchange in the US. Are there any talks going with Coinbase? What's the movement on this? Why is it taking so long? Is there anything you could do to move it forward? What's your thoughts?
I can't really comment on exchange listings, to be honest, for like a number of reasons. That being said, we have talked to exchanges in the past. Obviously, Fantom is listed on exchanges like you mentioned, and many others. That's the extent of what I can really say at the moment, unfortunately.
Can you speak to whether, because there's some rumors going around the community that one of the reasons Coinbase won't list Fantom is they're too worried it's deemed a security and fails their requirement tests? Is that just rumors?
Well, not to my knowledge. And remember, like Coinbase is still, operating as is, despite the fact that they're being sued allegedly for listing unregistered securities, right? And in the complaint that the SEC filed, it lists a number of tokens that the SEC alleges to be securities, right? And Coinbase is still, to my knowledge, trading those assets, or at least most of those assets that are alleged to be securities by the SEC, right? So I don't think that is necessarily the case or the concern for Fantom.
Got it. Michael, look, thank you so much for being so gracious with your time here. You really just sat here for an hour and 40 minutes during what is obviously a difficult time for yourself personally, the team, the ecosystem, and not something that was directly in your control. Yes, there were learnings to be had. I think we've covered that off extensively throughout this. You've been very candid, sharing things that you could have done better with hindsight. Hindsight's a great thing. And I think ultimately what's going to be remembered is not what happened, but how you bounce back, the lessons you take, and how you and the team and the ecosystem and the projects build trust back from here. Is there anything you want to add as a parting remark here on this podcast?
Yeah, well, thank you very much for your kind words and the opportunity to speak on this podcast. And I try to answer this as best as I can to like the knowledge that I have so far, and I'm sure like I'll find out a lot more information as the days go by, and I'll try and inform the community as much as I can. But I just want to say to the community that are out there, it's a very difficult time, and I'm very sorry like what everyone is going through, and but I am very, very confident we can bounce back from it. As I talked about on your show, with a lot of great developments, the foundation will continue developing as is. We've had challenges in the past before, where we didn't even have a platform, we didn't even have any users, and we were struggling back then, and we overcame those obstacles. And I'm very confident that given enough time, we can overcome these obstacles as well. Other chains have also faced obstacles before, as we talked about, like with Solana and FTX, and they overcame that. And I'm very confident we can overcome our challenges as well. Although I do acknowledge it is like a very difficult time overall.
Thank you again, Michael, for your time and candidness. Appreciate it. Speak soon.
Thanks a lot. Really appreciate it.